We're still in Volume 1, and this is Book 2. Funny way of naming books, but that's what he does. This is Book 2 in Volume 1 of The History of Protestantism by James A. Wiley. So, Book 2, Wickliffe and His Times of Advent of Protestantism, and Chapter 1, Wickliffe, His Birth, and Education. Our subtitles are listed here. The Principle and the Ritual. Rapid growth of the one. Slow progress and ultimate triumph of the other. England. Wickliffe. His birthplace, his education. Goes to Oxford. Enters Merton College. Its fame. The evangelical Bradwardine. His renown. Pioneers the way for Wickliffe. The philosophy of those days. Wycliffe's eminence as a scholastic. Studies also the canon and civil laws. His conversion. Theological studies. The Black Death. Ravages, Greece, Italy, etc. Enters England. Its awful desolations. Its impression on Wickliffe. Stands face to face with eternal death. Taught not to fear the death of the body. The 5th century brought with it a signal blessing to Christianity in the guise of a disaster. Like a tree that was growing too rapidly, it was cut down to its roots that it might escape the luxuriance which would have been its ruin. From a principle seated in the heart, the fruit of which is an enlightening, which is an enlightened understanding and a holy life. Religion, under the corrupting influences of power and riches, was being transformed into ritual, which, having its sphere solely in the senses, leaves the soul in darkness and the life in bondage. These two, the principle and the ritual, began so early as the 4th and 5th centuries to draw apart, and to develop each after its own kind. The rite rapidly progressed, and seemed far to outstrip its rival. It built for itself gorgeous temples. It enlisted in its service a powerful hierarchy. It added year by year to the number and magnificence of its ceremonies. It expressed itself in canons and constitutions, and seduced by this imposing show, nations bowed down before it, and puissant kings lent their swords for its defense and propagation. Far otherwise was it with the principle. Withdrawing into the spiritual sphere, it appeared to have abandoned the field to its antagonists. Not so, however. If it had hidden itself from the eyes of men, it was that it might build up from the very foundation, piling truth upon truth, and prepare in silence those mighty spiritual forces by which it was in due time to emancipate the world. Its progress was consequently less marked, but was far more real than that of its antagonist. Every error which one pressed into its service was a cause of weakness. Every truth which the other added to its creed was a source of strength. The uninstructed and superstitious hordes with which the one received into its communion were dangerous allies. They might follow it in the day of its prosperity, but they would desert it and become its foes wherever the tide of popular favor turned against it. Not so the adherents of the other. With purified hearts and enlightened understanding, they were prepared to follow it at all hazards. The number of its disciples, small at first, continually multiplied. The purity of their lives, the meekness with which they bore the injuries inflicted on them, and the heroism with which their death was endured, augmented from age to age the moral power and the spiritual glory of their cause. And thus, while the one reached its fall through its very success, the other marched on through oppression and proscription to triumph. We have arrived at the beginning of the 14th century. We have hitherto had no occasion to speak of the British Isles, but now our attention must be turned to them. Here a greater light is about to appear than any that had illumined the darkness of the ages that had gone before. In the North Riding of Yorkshire, watered by the Tees, lies the parish of Wickliffe. In the manor house of this parish, in the year 1324, was born a child, who was named John. Here his ancestors had lived since the time of the conquest, and according to the manner of the times, they took their surname from the place of their residence. And the son now born to them was known as John de Wickliffe. Of his boyhood nothing is recorded. He was destined from an early age for the church, which gives us ground to conclude that even then he discovered that penetrating intelligence which marked his mature years, and that loving sympathy which drew him so often in later life to the homesteads and the sick beds of his parish of Lutterworth. Schools for rudiment instruction were even then pretty thickly planted over England, in connection with the cathedral towns and the religious houses, and it was probable that the young Wickliffe received his first training at one of these seminaries in his own neighborhood. At the age of 16 or thereabouts, Wickliffe was sent to Oxford. Here he became first a scholar, and next a fellow of Merton College, the oldest foundation save one in Oxford. The youth of England, thirsty for knowledge, the fountains of which had long been sealed up, were then crowding to the universities, and when Wickliffe entered Merton there were no fewer than 30,000 students at Oxford. These numbers awakened surprise, but it is to be taken in account that many of the halls were no better than upper schools. The college which Wickliffe joined was the most distinguished at that seat of learning. The fame unrivaled in their own day, which two of its scholars, William Ockham and Duns Scotus, who had attained, shed a luster upon it. One of its chairs had been filled by the celebrated Bradwardine, who was closing his career at Merton about the time that the young Wickliffe was opening his in Oxford. Bradwardine was one of the first mathematicians and astronomers of his day, but having been drawn into the study of the Word of God, he embraced the doctrines of free grace, and his chair became a fountain of higher knowledge than that of natural science. While most of his contemporaries, by the aid of a subtle scholasticism, were endeavoring to penetrate into the essence of things and to explain all mysteries, Bradwardine was content to accept what God had revealed in his word, and this humility was rewarded by his finding the path which others missed. Lifting the veil, he unfolded it to his students, who crowded round him with eager attention and admiring reverence, the way of life, warning them especially against the Pelagianism which was rapidly substituting a worship of externals for a religion of the heart, and teaching men to trust in their power of will for a salvation which can come only from the sovereign grace of God. Bradwardine was greater as a theologian than he had been as a philosopher. The fame of his lectures filled Europe, and his evangelical views, dispersed by his scholars, helped to prepare the way for Wickliffe and others who were to come after him. It was around his chair that the new day was seen first to break. A quick apprehension, a penetrating intellect, and a retentive memory enabled the young scholar of Merton to make rapid progress in the learning of those days. Philosophy then lay in guesses rather than in facts. Whatever could be known from having been put before man in the facts of nature or the doctrines of revelation was deemed not worth further investigation. It was too humble an occupation to observe and to deduce. In the pride of his genius, man turned away from a field lying at his feet and plunged boldly into a region where, having no data to guide him and no ground for solid footing, he could learn really nothing. From this region of vague speculation, the explorer brought back only the images of his own creating, and dressing up these fancies as facts, he passed them off as knowledge. From this region of vague speculation, the explorer brought back only the images of his own creating, and dressing up these fancies as facts, he passed them off as knowledge. Such was the philosophy that invented the study of Wickliffe. There was scarce enough in it to reward his labor, but he thirsted for knowledge, and giving himself to it with his might, he soon became a master in the scholastic philosophy, and did not fear to encounter the subtlest of all the disputants of the schools of Oxford. He was famously reputed, says Fox, for a great clerk, a deep schoolman, and no less expert in all kinds of philosophy. Walden, his bitter enemy, writing to Pope Martin V about him, says that he was wonderfully astonished at the vehemence and force of his reasoning, and the places of authority with which they were fortified. To his knowledge of scholastic he added great proficiency in both the canon and civil laws. By these studies he became versed in the constitution and laws of his native country, and was fitted for taking an intelligent part in the battle, which soon thereafter rose between the usurpations of the pontiff and the rights of the crown of England. He had an eye for the most different things, says Leckler, speaking of Wickliffe, and took a lively interest in the most multifarious questions. But the foundation of Wycliffe's greatness was found in a higher learning than any that man can give. It was the illumination of his mind and the renewal of his heart by the instrumentality of the Bible that made him the reformer, certainly the greatest of all reformers who appeared before the era of Luther. Without this, he might have been remembered as an eminent scholar of the 14th century, whose fame was luminous enough to transmit a few feeble rays to our own age, but he never would have been known as the first to bear the axe into the wilderness of papal abuses, and to strike at the root of that great tree of which others had been content to lop off a few of the branches. The honor would not have been his to be the first to raise that great protest, which nations will bear onward until it shall have circled the earth, proclaiming, "Fallen is every idol, raised is every stronghold of darkness and tyranny, and now is come salvation and the kingdom of our Lord and of his Christ, and he shall reign forever." How Wickliffe came to a knowledge of the truth is not difficult to guess. He was, D'Aubigny informs us, one of the scholars of the evangelical Bradwardine. As he heard the great master discourse day by day on the sovereignty of grace and the freeness of salvation, a new light would begin to break upon the mind of the young scholar. He would turn to a more divine page than that of Plato. But for this, Wickliffe might have entered the priesthood without ever having studied a single chapter of the Bible, for instruction in theology formed no part of preparation for the sacred office in those days. No doubt theology, after a fashion, was studied, yet not a theology whose substance was drawn from the Bible, but a man-invented system. The bachelors of theology in the lowest grade held readings in the Bible. Not so, however, the bachelors of the higher grades. These founded their predilections upon the sentences of Peter Lombard. Puffed up with the conceit of their mystical lore, they regarded it beneath their dignity to expound so elementary a book as the Holy Scriptures. The former were named, contemptuously, biblicists. The latter were honorably designated sententari, or men of the sentences. There was no mention, says Fox, describing the early days of Wickliffe, nor almost any word spoken of Scriptures. Instead of Peter and Paul, men occupied their time in studying Aquinas and Scotus, and the Master of Sentences. Scarcely any other thing was seen in the temples or churches, or taught or spoken in sermons, or finally intended or gone about in their whole life, but only heaping up of certain shadowed ceremonies upon ceremonies. Neither was there any end of their heaping. The people were taught to worship no other thing but that which they did see, and they did see almost nothing which they did not worship. In the midst of these groveling superstitions, men were startled by the approach of a terrible visitant. The year 1348 was fatally signalized by the outbreak of a fearful pestilence, one of the most destructive in history. Appearing first in Asia, it took a westerly course, traversing the globe like the pale horse and his rider in the Apocalypse, terror marching before it and death following in its wake. It ravaged the shores of the Levant. It desolated Greece, and going on still toward the west, it struck Italy with terrible severity. Florence, the lovely capital of Etruria, it turned into a storehouse of the dead. The genius of Boccaccio, painted its horrors, and the muse of Petrarch bewailed its desolation. The latter had cause, for Laura was among its victims. Passing the Alps, it entered northern Europe, leaving, say some contemporary historians, only a tenth of the human race alive. This, we know, is an exaggeration, but it expresses the popular impression and sufficiently indicates the awful character of those ravages in which all men heard, as it were, the footsteps of coming death. The sea as well as land was marked with its devastating prints. Ships voyaging afar on the ocean were overtaken by it, and when the winds piloted them to land, they were found to be freighted with none but the dead. On the 1st of August, the plague touched the shores of England. Beginning at Dorchester, says Fox, every day 20, some days 40, some 50 and more dead corpses were brought and laid together in one heap, in one deep pit. On the first day of November it reached London, where, says some chronicler, the vehement rage thereof was so hot, and did increase so much, that from the first day of February until about the beginning of May, in a churchyard then newly made by Smithfield, was about 200 dead corpses every day were buried, besides those which in other churchyards of the city were laid also. In those days, says another old chronicler, Caxton, was death without sorrow, weddings without friendship, flight without succor. Scarcely were there left living folk for to bury honestly them that were dead. One of the citizens of London put not fewer than 100,000 perished. The ravages of the plague were spread over all England, and a full half of the nation was struck down. Men from the pestilence passed to the lower animals. Putrid carcasses covered the fields. The labors of the husbandman were suspended. The soil ceased to be plowed, and the harvest to be reaped. The courts of law were closed, and Parliament did not meet. Everywhere reigned terror, mourning, and death. This dispensation was the harbinger of a very different one. The tempest that scattered the earth opened the way for the shower which was to fertilize it. The plague was not without its influence on that great movement which, beginning with Wickliffe, was continued in a line of confessors and martyrs until it issued in the Reformation of Luther and Calvin. Wickliffe had been a witness to the passage of the destroyer, and he had seen the human race fading from the earth as if the ages had completed their cycle, and the end of the world was at hand. He was then in his 25th year, and could not but be deeply impressed by the awful events passing around him. This visitation of the Almighty, says de Bigny, sounded like a trumpet of the judgment day in the heart of Wickliffe. Bradwardine had already brought him to the Bible. The plague brought him to it a second time, and now, doubtless, he searched its page more earnestly than ever. He came to it, not as the theologian, seeking in it a deeper wisdom than any mystery which the scholastic philosophy could open to him, nor as the scholar, to refine his taste by its pure models, and enrich his understanding by the sublimity of its doctrines, nor even as the polemic, in search of weapons wherewith to assail the dominant superstitions. He now came to the Bible as a lost sinner, seeking how he might be saved. Nearer every day came the messenger of the Almighty. The shadow that messenger cast before him was hourly deepening, and we can hear the young student, who doubtless in that hour felt the barrenness and insufficiency of the philosophy of the schools, lifting up with increasing vehemence the cry, "Who shall deliver me from the wrath to come?" It would seem to be a law that all who are to be reformers in their age shall first undergo a conflict of soul. They must feel in their own case the strength of error, the bitterness of the bondage in which it holds men, and stand face to face with the omnipotent judge before they can become the deliverers of others. This only can inspire them with pity for the wretched captives whose fetters they seek to break, and give them courage to brave the oppressor from whose cruelty they labor to rescue them. This agony of soul did Luther and Calvin undergo, and a distress and torrent similar in character, though perhaps not so great in degree, did Wickliffe endure before beginning his work. His sins doubtless were made a heavy burden to him, so heavy that he could not lift up his head. Standing on the brink of the pit, he says, he felt how awful it was to go down into the eternal night, and inhabit everlasting burning. The joy of escape from a doom so terrible made him feel how small a matter is the life of the body, and how little to be regarded are the torments which the tyrants of the earth have it in their power to inflict, compared with the wrath of the ever-living God. It is in these fires that the reformers have been hardened. It is in this school that they have learned to defy death and to sing at the stake. In this armor was Wickliffe clad before he was sent forth into battle. Chapter 2. Wickliffe and Papal Encroachments in England. Our subtitles here. Personal appearance of Wickliffe. His academic career. Bachelor of Theology. Lectures on the Bible. England quarrels with the Pope. Wickliffe defends the King's prerogative. Innocent III. The Pope appoints to the See of Canterbury. King John resists. England smitten with interdict. Terrors of the sentence. The Pope deposes the King. Invites the French King to conquer England. John becomes the Pope's vassal. The barons extort Magna Carta. The Pope excommunicates the barons, annuls the charter. The courage of the barons saves England. Demand of Urban V. Growth of England. National opposition to papal usurpations. Papal abuses. Statutes of provisors and praemunire. Praemunire. There it is. That's it. Statutes and provisors of praemunire. Of the merely personal incidents of Wickliffe's life, almost nothing is recorded. The service done for his own times and for the ages that followed occupy historians to the exclusion of all strictly personal matters. Few have acted so large a part and filled so conspicuous a place in the eyes of the world, of whom so few private thoughts and details have been preserved. The charm of a singular sweetness and the grace of a rare humility and modesty appear to have characterized him. These qualities were blended with a fine dignity, which he wore easily, as those nobly born do the insignia of their rank. Not blameless merely, but holy, was the life he lived in an age of unexampled degeneracy. From this portrait, says the younger Macri, which has been preserved, some idea may be formed of the personal appearance of the man. He must have been a person of noble aspect and commanding attitude. The dark, piercing eye, the aquiline features, the firm-set lips, and the sarcastic smile that mantles over them exactly agree with all we know of the bold and unsparing character of the reformer. A few sentences will suffice to trace the various stages of Wickliffe's academic career. He passed 20 years at Merton College, Oxford, first as scholar, next as a fellow. In 1360, he was appointed to the mastership of Balliol College. This preferment he owed to the fame he had acquired as a scholastic. Having become a bachelor of theology, Wickliffe had now the privilege of giving public lectures in the university on the books of Scripture. He was forbidden to enter into the higher field of the sentences of Peter of Lombardy, if indeed he was desirous of doing so. This belonged exclusively to the higher grade of bachelors and doctors in theology. But the expositions he now gave of the books of Holy Writ proved of great use to himself. He became more profoundly versed in the knowledge of divine things, and thus was the professor unwittingly prepared for the great work of reforming the Church, to which the labors of his later life were to be directed. He was soon thereafter appointed, 1365, to be head of Canterbury Hall. This was a new college, founded by Simon de Islip, Archbishop of Canterbury. The constitution of this college ordained that its fellowships should be held by 4 monks and 8 secular priests. The rivalship existing between the two orders was speedily productive of broils, and finally led to a conflict with the university authorities, and the founder, finding the plan unworkable, dismissed the 4 monks, replaced them with seculars, and appointed Wickliffe as master or warden. Within a year, Islip died, and was succeeded in the primacy by Langham, who, himself a monk, restored the expelled regulars, and, displacing Wickliffe from his wardenship, appointed a new head to the college. Wickliffe then appealed to the Pope, but Langham had greater influence at Rome, and after a long delay in 1730, the cause was given against Wickliffe. It was pending this decision that events happened which opened to Wickliffe a wider arena than the halls of Oxford. Henceforth, it was not against the monks of Canterbury Hall, or even the primate of England. It was against the Prince Pontiff of Christendom that Wickliffe was to do battle. In order to understand what we are now to relate, we must go back a century. The throne of England was then filled by King John, a vicious, pusillanimous, and despotic monarch, but nevertheless capable by fits and starts of daring and brave deeds. In 1205, Hubert, the primate of England, died. The junior canons of Canterbury met clandestinely that very night, and without any cogna d'alire, elected Reginald, their sub-prior, Bishop of Canterbury, and installed him in the archbishoprical throne before midnight. By next dawn, Reginald was on his way to Rome, whether he had been dispatched by his brethren to solicit the Pope's confirmation of his election. When the king came to the knowledge of the transaction, he was enraged at its temerity, and set about procuring the election of the Bishop of Norwich to the primacy. Both parties, the king and the canons, sent agents to Rome to plead their cause before the Pope. The man who then filled the chair of Peter, Innocent III, was vigorously prosecuting the audacious project of Gregory VII of subordinating the rights and power of princes to the papal see, and of taking into his own hand the appointment of all the episcopal sees of Christendom, that through the bishops and priests, now reduced to an absolute monarchy entirely dependent upon the Vatican, he might govern at his will all the kingdoms of Europe. No pope was ever more successful in this ambition than the man before whom the King of England, on the one hand, and the canons of Canterbury on the other, now carried their cause. Innocent annulled both elections, that of the canons and of the king, and made his own nominee, Cardinal Langton, be chosen to the see of Canterbury. But this was not all. The king had appealed to the Pope, and Innocent saw in this a precedent not to be let slip, for putting in the gift of the pontiff in all time coming what, after the papal throne, was the most important dignity in the Roman Church. John could not but see the danger and feel the humiliation implied in the step taken by Innocent. The See of Canterbury was the first seat of dignity and jurisdiction in England, the throne excepted, and foreign power had appointed one to fill that august seat. In an age in which the ecclesiastical was a more formidable authority than the temporal, this was an alarming encroachment on the royal prerogative and the nation's independence. Why should the Pope be content to appoint to the See of Canterbury? Why should the Pope be content to appoint to the See of Canterbury? Why should he not also appoint to the throne, the one other seat in the realm that rose above it? The king protested with many oaths that the Pope's nominee should never sit in the archiepiscopal chair. He waxed bold for the moment, and began the battle as if he meant to win it. He turned the canons of Canterbury out of doors, ordered all the prelates and abbots to leave the kingdom, and bade defiance to the Pope. It was not difficult to foresee what would be the end of a conflict carried on by the weakest of England's monarchs against the haughtiest and most powerful popes of Rome, and against the haughtiest and most powerful of Rome's popes. The pontiff smote England with interdict. The king had offended, and the whole nation must be punished along with him. Before we can realize the terrors of such a sentence, we must forget all that the past 3 centuries have taught us, and surrender our imaginations to the superstitious beliefs which armed the interdict with its tremendous power. The men of those times on whom the doom fell saw the gates of heaven locked by the strong hand of the pontiff, so that none might enter who came from the unhappy realm lying under the papal ban. All who departed this life must wander forlorn as disembodied ghosts in some doleful region amid unknown sufferings until it should please him who carried the keys to open the closed gates. As the earthly picture of the spiritual doom, all the symbols of grace and all the ordinances of religion were suspended. The church doors were closed. The lights at the altar were extinguished. The bells ceased to be rung. The crosses and images were taken down and laid on the ground. Infants were baptized in the church porch. Marriages were celebrated in the churchyard. The dead were buried in ditches or in open fields. No one durst rejoice, or eat flesh, or shave his head, or pay any decent attention to this person or apparel. It was meet only that signs of distress and mourning and woe should be visible throughout a land which there rested the wrath of the Almighty. For so did men account the ban of the pontiff. King John braved the state of matters for 2 whole years. But Pope Innocent was not to be turned from his purpose. He resolved to visit and bow the obstinacy of the monarch by a yet more terrible infliction. He pronounced sentence of excommunication upon John, deposing him from his throne and absolving his subjects from allegiance. To carry out the sentence, it needed an armed force, and Innocent, casting his eyes around him, fixed on Philip Augustus, King of France, as the most suitable person to deal the blow on John, offering him the kingdom of England for his pains. It was not the interest of Philip to undertake such an enterprise, for the same boundless and uncontrollable power which was tumbling the King of England from his throne might the next day, on some ghostly pretense or other, hurl King Philip Augustus from his. But the prize was a tempting one, and the monarch of France, collecting a mighty armament, prepared to cross the Channel and invade England. When King John saw the brink on which he stood, his courage or obstinacy forsook him. He craved an interview with Pandolf, the Pope's legate, and after a short conference he promised to submit himself unreservedly to the papal see. Besides engaging to make full restitution to the clergy for the losses they had suffered, he resigned England and Ireland to God, to St. Peter, and to St. Paul, and to Pope Innocent. And to his successors in the apostolic chair, he agreed to hold these dominions as feudatory to the Church of Rome by the annual payment of 1,000 marks. He stipulated that if he or his successors should ever presume to revoke or infringe this charter, they should instantly, except upon admonition they repented of their offense, forfeit all right to their dominions. The transaction was finished by the king doing homage to Pandolf as the Pope's legate, with all the submissive rights which the feudal law required of vassals before their liege lord and superior. Taking off his crown, it is said, John laid it on the ground, and the legate, to show the mightiness of his master, spurning it with his foot, kicked it about like a worthless bauble, and then, picking it out of the dust, placed it on the craven head of the monarch. This transaction took place on the 15th of May, 1213. There is no moment of more profound humiliation than this in the annals of England. But the barons were resolved not to be the slaves of a pope. Their intrepidity and patriotism wiped off the ineffable disgrace which the baseness of the monarch had inflicted on the country. Unsheathing their swords, they vowed to maintain the ancient liberties of England, or die in the attempt. Appearing before the king at Oxford, April 1215, here, they said, is the charter which consecrates the liberties confirmed by Henry II, and which you have also solemnly sworn to observe. The king stormed. I will not, he said, grant you liberties which would make me a slave. John forgot that he had already become a slave, but the barons were not to be daunted by haughty words which the king had no power to maintain. He was as odious to the whole nation, and on the 5th of June, 1215, John signed the Magna Carta at Runnymede. This was in effect to tell Innocent that he revoked his vow of vassalage and took back the kingdom which he had laid at his feet. When tidings were carried to Rome of what John had done, the ire of Innocent III was kindled to the uttermost, that he, the vicar of God, who held all the crowns of Christendom in his hand, and stood with his foot planted on all its kingdoms, should be so affronted and defied, was not to be borne. Was he not the feudal lord of the kingdom? Was not England rightfully his? Had it not been laid at his feet by a deed of covenant solemnly ratified? Who were these wretched barons, that they should withstand the pontifical will, and place the independence of their country above the glory of the church? Innocent instantly launched an anathema against these impious and rebellious men, at the same time inhibiting the king from carrying out the provisions of the charter which he had signed, or in any way fulfilling its stipulations. But Innocent went further yet. In the exercise of that singular prescience, which belongs to that system by which this truculent holder of the tiara was so thoroughly inspired, and of which he was so perfect an embodiment, he divined the true nature of the transaction at Runnymede. Magna Carta was a great political protest against himself and his system. It inaugurated an order of political ideas and a class of political rights entirely antagonistic to the fundamental principles and claims of the papacy. Magna Carta was constitutional liberty standing up before the face of the papal absolutism and throwing down the gauge of battle to it. Innocent felt that he must grapple now with this hateful and monstrous birth, and strangle it in its cradle. Otherwise, should he wait until he was grown, it might be too strong for him to crush. Already it had reft away from him one of the fairest of those realms which he had made dependent upon the tiara. It assaults the papal prerogative. Its assault on the papal prerogative would not end here. He must trample it down before its insolence had grown by success, and other kingdoms and their rulers, inoculated with the impiety of these audacious barons, had begun to imitate their example. Accordingly, fulminating a bull from the plenitude of his apostolic power and from the authority of his commission, as set by God over the kingdoms, to pluck up and to destroy, to build and to plant, he annulled and abrogated the charter, declaring all of its obligations and guarantees void. In the signing of the Great Charter, we see a new force coming into the field to make war against that tyranny which first corrupted the souls of men before it enslaved their bodies. The divine or evangelistic element came first. Political Liberty came after, and the former is the true nurse of the latter. For no country can liberty endure and ripen its fruit where it has not had its beginning in the moral part of man. Innocent was already contending against the evangelical principle in the Crusades against the Albigenses in the south of France, and now there appeared, among the more hardy nations of the north, another antagonist, the product of the first, that had come to strengthen the battle against a power from which its seat on the seven hills was absorbing all rights and enslaving all nations. The bold attitude of the barons saved the independence of the nation. Innocent went to the grave. Feebler men succeeded him in the pontifical chair. The kings of England mounted the throne without taking the oath of fealty to the Pope, although they continued to transmit year by year the 1,000 marks which John had agreed to pay to the papal treasury. At last, in the reign of Edward II, this annual payment was quietly dropped. No remonstrance against its discontinuance came from Rome. And that's all the time I have today. So we're going to have to pick up right here Thursday when I come back in the second hour of my broadcast time. I want to thank you all for joining me today. Please pray for me. Pray for First Amendment Radio and the work that we're doing here. And pray for our nation as well. May the Almighty bless you all and keep you as you travel on the narrow way that leads to life. I'll see you next time.
Years ahead of the dominant media, FirstAmendmentRadio.com and FirstAmendmentRadio.net.
all God's people said, amen. Thank you.
The program you are listening to is 100% sponsored by you, the listener, on this First Amendment Rights Media channel. You will notice that there are few commercials on this radio network. There's a good reason for that. Corporate advertising dollars come with strings that limit program content. So without your help, these programs cannot continue on satellite, internet, or our several affiliates. If you benefit by the educational law programs, we ask you to give. If you are admonished or nurtured by the Bible and ministry programs, we ask you to give. If some voice a cause that you are passionate about, we ask you to give. If you believe in any of these, we ask you to support them as you would a missionary on a continual basis, as if giving a tithe for missionary radio. These programs are not commercially viable and must be supported by those faithful to the cause of truth. Look for the button to sponsor your favorite programs at our listen and schedule pages on the internet. We will also give you unlimited archive access to all of our programs. We're asking you to give much less than a tithe so that you may also send support directly to a particular program host, cause, and anywhere else the Spirit may lead you. Do all to the glory of our God and Creator, for His holy nation, the only kingdom that will last forever. Thank you for listening.
Secrets of the Rapture. Is there a 500-year-old conspiracy? A propaganda machine so pervasive and entrenched, yet so elusive that the entire world could be taken in by it, working in plain sight, but unseen by the world for what it truly is? If prophecy is God-given history in advance, why does the prophecy that has conquered the age also exclude nearly 2,000 years of history? What is it that they are afraid that the light of history will reveal? To understand our place in time and prophecy, we must look in history for an interpretation, that which stands the test of time, that which agrees with the Word of God, and history has proven to be true. When cunning fables and fearful speculations are removed from our sight, then we may clearly see what is truly expressed in Bible prophecy, both that which has been fulfilled and that which has yet to come. God's express word is the sword that must be wielded to remove the scales from the eyes and dispel the darkness of deceitful conjecture. Secrets of the Rapture was written to expose that which the spirit of the age has conjured out of the darkness to blind the eyes of the church in the world today. Secrets of the Rapture, Deconstructing Pre-Tribulation Dispensational Futurism by yours truly, Nicholas Arthur, is now available at lulu.com and Amazon. Secrets of the Rapture. Be informed, edified, and grow in the faith as your spirit is daily nourished in a biblical worldview, because you love the truth. FirstAmendmentRadio.net/MOBI. Faith comes by hearing, and hearing by the Word of God. Always listenable, at work or on the go. FirstAmendmentRadio.net/MOBI. No download or app necessary.